What's going on? I'm Trey. I'm a cameraman and a drone pilot, and I'm pretty new to FPV, but I've been shooting and color grading GoPro footage for a very long time. My first camera was actually a GoPro, and since then, I've put them through the ringer. I've messed with every setting. I found all the bugs and quirks. I conducted some very thorough stress tests. And then once I started flying, I figured out how to dial all that in specifically for capturing cinematic FPV flight footage. So this is a pretty deep dive into all this camera's parameters. If you just want the GoPro settings, you can actually hold your GoPro up to the screen. It'll scan this QR code and you'll be set to go, but I'm gonna break it all down so that you know how and why to tweak these settings for your own personal style. Also, I'm gonna do a part 2 on how to post-process your footage, color grading and stabilization, all that. So like and subscribe if you wanna see that, and let's get into this. First up, I always use the GoPro Quick app and the QR control app. And Quick is just so I can preview my frame. Even though I have a front-facing LCD, it's always better to be able to look at your frame on a bigger screen without your face all up in like 85% of the shot. So that's really useful. And QR control is where I generated that QR code from last time. It lets you input all your camera settings and then just hold it up to the lens, and it's set to go. Super quick and easy, especially when your GoPro is already attached to your quad. Comes in super clutch. Second, shoot in 4K or 5K, 4x3 at 30 frames. Just trust me, we'll talk more about it. Third is get some ND filters. They don't have to be expensive. They shouldn't be expensive. You're probably gonna break them. I broke one, you can see. But they're crucial to getting the shot, and here's why. So for cinematic footage, unless you are specifically going for a slow motion shot, you should be shooting at 24 or 30 frames per second. But no matter what frame rate you're shooting, you should always lock your shutter at 180-degree shutter angle. That just means 1 over twice your frame rate. So I shoot at 30 frames per second, 1 over 60 shutter speed. That rule applies to all cameras all the time, and it gives your footage a natural motion blur closest to what your eyes actually see. So if your shutter speed is too low, your frames look blurry. But if they're too high, it looks sharp and unrealistic. But to circle back, the reason that you'll need ND filters is because when you lock into that shutter speed, you're also locked into that exposure parameter. So in full daylight, you'll probably be overexposed even if your ISO is all the way down at 100. On a DSLR or a video camera, you have a third way to change your exposure, which is your aperture. But you can't change that on a GoPro, so instead you have to decrease the actual amount of light coming into the sensor, and you do that with an ND filter. I think it makes sense to get like a 4-stop, 8-stop, and 16-stop. You'll probably use a 4-stop like at dusk or sunrise. 8-stop or a 16-stop usually does the trick for brighter situations or high sun, but you know, they look pretty badass, and they're dark because they're reducing the amount of light that goes into the camera. So if you start with your shutter speed at 1 over 60 and your ISO at 100, then you can take a look at your shot and see whether you need to drop your exposure, and you can tweak it from there, because if you put an ND8 onto your camera, you're decreasing the amount of light by 8 stops. When you increase or decrease any of the parameters on your camera by 1 unit, like ISO 100 to 200, that's 1 stop. So you can use these to get closer to where you want and then dial it in bit by bit in the camera. Usually all your exposure settings should be locked, meaning they don't change based on the environment. There's no auto adjustment, but if you're working with a really, really high dynamic range situation, then you can set your minimum and maximum ISO to a certain range. For me, it's really a pain to try and color grade when your footage is changing from lighter to darker. It makes post-processing way harder, and I'd rather have to push the footage a little bit more than try and account for it changing, but that's just me. So now that you're properly exposed, let's talk about color. For white balance, my default is 5,000 Kelvin. For flying outside, that usually hits the sweet spot. Your footage might be a little bit warmer than you want, but I've always found that cooling footage down in post always looks more natural than trying to warm it up. I might drop it down for night shooting or for like a winter scene, but for the most part, it's 5,000. I have tried using the native white balance, and it's actually really hard to grade. I worked with it a lot, and I even tried the conversion LUT but it was super hard to make it look natural. It always came out a little orangey. I like the idea of it, but it never really worked. I stopped using it and I don't recommend it. Color profile, I'm always in the flat color profile. It's like a semi-log format. It extends your dynamic range a little bit, but it means that you really have to add the contrast in post-processing. So if you don't like color grading, I don't recommend that. I'll be going over color grading in the next video, but if you're not into that, then probably just shoot in the GoPro color profile, and that'll give you a more punchy, contrasted image right off the bat. Sharpness, so from what I've read, seen, and tested, medium is where it's at. On a scale of 1 to 10, if low sharpness is 1 and 10 is high, then medium sharpness is at like a 6 or 7. So there's not that much of a difference. I just prefer less baked in processing, and high sharpness always looked a little bit weird to me, but as long as you don't set it on low, you're good. Bitrate is extremely important. It'll make your file size larger, but your resulting image will be much clearer, it'll be more crisp, it'll have more bit depth and color depth, and then when you zoom it in to 4x5 or 9x16, it'll still be sharp and clear and punchy when you post it to socials. That is as long as you export with the right settings, so make sure you watch part 2 to get the best upload quality. Stabilization, I love Real Steady. It's the best stabilization I've ever used, but that means you have to turn Hyper Smooth off. If you're not gonna use Real Steady, definitely leave it on, but you're still gonna need to do some stabilization in post. It's not gonna be even close to as good. In my opinion, Real Steady is a no-brainer. It's $100. It's a really simple plugin, and it basically uses the gyroscopic data from the GoPro to stabilize the image instead of image stabilization, which is what warp stabilizer and those kind of are. And the results are undeniable. If you're gonna fly FPV, it's worth the investment. Last, but definitely not least, formatting your card. Whatever you do, don't sleep on this. I lost way too much footage because I either didn't format the card properly or I got a cheap knockoff SD. Don't do either of those. Designate cards that you'll be using for your GoPro, and before you put the card in the camera, do a full format, not a quick format, a full format, and then put it in your GoPro and format it on there. Again, if you only use it for the GoPro, you'll only have to do that once. And I promise it's worth it, because whether you're doing a paid shoot or just messing around, it sucks losing footage. You're also putting your GoPro in a lot of scenarios where there's a risk of it getting knocked around, the battery getting loose, or stuff getting hit. And if the recording gets stopped and the card isn't properly formatted, then you basically just lose your footage. But if your card is formatted right and something bad happens, there's a much better chance of you recovering the footage if your card is formatted properly. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. If it was, or if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe to stick around, and I will see y'all in the next one. Peace.